It was a humid Wednesday morning, October 28, 2015, when the dense mist still clung to the acacia trees inside Uganda's Murchison Falls National Park. The roar of the distant waterfall blended with the calls of hornbills and the occasional grunt of a hippo submerged in the Nile. For most visitors, this was paradise, a raw, untamed reminder of the African wilderness. But for 21-year-old Dutch student Sophia Ketzier, something felt wrong. Her travel companions noticed it in the way her eyes darted across the horizon, as if searching for something only she could see. She had been restless since dawn, pacing outside the small safari lodge, whispering fragments of thoughts in Dutch, sometimes to no one in particular. Sophia's friends knew about her diagnosis, bipolar disorder confirmed only months earlier, and had urged the local safari guide to keep the day short or seek medical assistance. But the guide, a man in his late 30s with an easy smile and a habit of brushing off concerns, assured them everything was fine. "The wild has a way of calming the mind," he said, starting the Land Cruiser. The engine coughed to life, and soon they were bumping along the red dirt tracks that cut through the golden savanna grass. Inside the vehicle, Sophia sat near the open side panel, her hair whipping in the wind. The sun had barely risen, but the heat was already creeping in. She clutched a small leather notebook, flipping through pages filled with messy handwriting and crude sketches of birds, trees, and, oddly, spirals. At one moment she leaned toward the guide, asking questions about the animals. The next, she fell silent, staring at the distance with an unreadable expression. By midday, the group stopped for a break under the shade of a lone fig tree. They unpacked sandwiches and bottled water, the kind of simple lunch that usually tasted better in the wild. Sophia, however, barely touched hers. She wandered a few steps away, looking out over the open plain where giraffes moved like slow shadows against the horizon. One friend called after her, but she waved them off, muttering, "I just need air." The guide noticed but didn't intervene. He was more focused on preparing the next leg of the safari, eager to show the group the hippopods along the riverbank before the afternoon heat made them retreat into the water. When they finally packed up, Sophia hesitated before climbing back into the truck. "Maybe I should just walk," she said quietly. The others laughed nervously, thinking she was joking. The last clear memory anyone had of her that day was just after they crossed a shallow creek, the tires spraying mud. Sophia had leaned forward, pointing to something in the bush. The guide slowed down. In that moment of distraction, she slipped from the vehicle's side. No one knew if she jumped or simply stepped out. When they realized she was gone, the guide slammed the brakes. The savanna was silent except for the hum of insects. No Sophia. No footprints visible in the dry earth. Just the empty, sunlit grasslands stretching endlessly in every direction. The moment Sophia's absence registered, panic surged through the group. They called her name, their voices sharp against the endless expanse, but the wind seemed to swallow every syllable. The guide insisted she couldn't have gone far. There was nowhere to hide in the open grassland. Yet the savanna had a way of deceiving the eye. Tall reeds, sudden dips in the terrain, and thickets that from a distance looked like harmless shrubs but concealed dense, tangled growth. They fanned out in a rough semicircle, scanning the horizon for the flash of her white shirt or the movement of her blonde hair. Nothing. Within minutes, the midday sun became oppressive, making every step heavier, every thought slower. The guide's radio crackled with static as he tried to reach another vehicle in the area. His tone remained outwardly calm, but a faint tremor in his hand betrayed his nerves. Sophia's friends pressed him to call the park rangers immediately. He hesitated. Each minute lost felt like a gamble. Eventually, a terse message went out. "Missing female, last seen near the southern track by the creek crossing." In a place as vast as Murchison Falls, those words were both precise and useless. Rangers arrived with a battered pickup, their uniforms dusty, rifles slung over shoulders more for wildlife than for any human threat. They questioned the guide first, noting the circumstances, his decision to proceed despite warnings of Sophia's mental state. As the search began, the reality of the landscape set in. The grass was shoulder-high in places, hiding everything but the tallest animals. Elephant tracks crisscrossed the soil, and hippo paths carved deep channels to the river, each a potential hazard. Hours passed. The group moved methodically, calling out, checking along the riverbank, scanning from the elevated ridges. Occasionally they found a faint impression in the dirt, a scuff mark that could have been from a shoe or from an antelope's hoof. The light began to shift, the sun lowering and casting long shadows that distorted the land. The guide grew restless, pacing, scanning his surroundings with a sudden urgency. He muttered about returning at dawn when the light would be better, but Sophia's friends resisted. "We don't stop until we find her," one said, her voice cracking. By sunset the park transformed. The air cooled, the calls of nocturnal animals began. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. Sophia was still out there, somewhere, and now the dark was coming. Lanterns flickered to life, but their beams felt small against the vast encroaching night. Each rustle in the grass made hearts race. Somewhere beyond the reach of their voices, the wilderness closed in, indifferent and silent. Night in Murchison Falls was unlike anything Sophia's friends had ever experienced. Thick, almost tangible darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. The stars burned bright above, but on the ground, the world dissolved into shadows and whispers. The search party gathered at the creek crossing where she'd last been seen, lanterns arranged in a rough circle. Every so often, a hyena's laughter echoed in the distance, a chilling reminder of how quickly the wild could turn hostile. The rangers divided them into pairs, instructing them to stay within sight of each lantern's glow. One carried a powerful spotlight, sweeping it in arcs across the grasslands. Each time the beam caught the eyeshine of an animal, antelope, warthog, once even a lion far off, hearts leapt, only to sink again. The guide kept to the edge of the group, speaking little, his usual self-assured manner replaced by a rigid, watchful tension. Around midnight, a faint sound carried over the breeze, a single, high-pitched note, almost like someone calling. Everyone froze. The rangers signaled for silence, straining to hear. It came again, but fainter, and from a different direction. They pushed toward it, moving quickly but carefully, ears tuned to every shift in the wind. When they reached the source, they found nothing. Only a patch of disturbed grass and a scattering of broken stems, as if something, or someone, had moved through there not long before. The hours blurred together. Mosquitoes whined in their ears, the scent of dust and damp earth thick in the air. Every step felt heavier, weighed down by fatigue and dread. One ranger quietly suggested she might have gone toward the river. People in distress sometimes gravitated to water. They followed a hippo trail down to the bank, their boots sinking in the mud. The moonlight turned the Nile into a strip of molten silver, its surface smooth and deceptively calm. The guide shone his flashlight across the water, but there was only the ripple of fish and the shifting shapes of crocodiles just beneath the surface. By 3 a.m., the rangers made the call to pause until sunrise. It was a decision none of Sophia's friends wanted, but the darkness was absolute now, and the risk of losing another person was real. They returned to the lodge in silence, the vehicle's headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the night. In her small, unoccupied room, Sophia's bed was still neatly made. Her backpack sat on the floor, partially unzipped, with clothes folded inside. The only thing missing was her notebook, the one she'd been holding in the truck. No one spoke, but they all thought the same thing. Whatever had happened out there, she had taken it, and herself, into the wild, and the night had swallowed them whole. At first light, the park shifted again. The darkness peeled back to reveal an almost surreal beauty. Mist rolled over the plains, and the distant roar of Murchison Falls returned, steady and unyielding. The Rangers wasted no time. By 6 a.m., two teams were moving out. One on foot, retracing the path from the previous day, and another in a small boat along the Nile's edge. Helicopter support was requested from the nearest city, but fuel shortages meant it would take hours to arrive. Sophia's friends joined the foot search, their eyes scanning for any sign. A dropped item, an impression in the dirt. Anything. They followed animal tracks, dry stream beds, even the faint traces of human footprints. Once they came across a sandal half buried in the soil, but it was old, weathered, and far too large to have been hers. The guide walked ahead of them, avoiding conversation, his gaze fixed forward. He didn't mention it, but he knew every additional hour meant the trail grew colder. Mid-morning they reached a cluster of acacia trees, where the grass was pressed down in an irregular pattern. One ranger crouched, running his hand over the flattened stems. It could have been a resting spot for buffalo, or for a person. Nearby, caught in a thorny bush, was a scrap of paper. It was from a notebook, the edges frayed, the ink smudged from moisture. Written in looping, hurried handwriting were the words, "Too loud here, need quiet." The group fell silent. The rangers marked the spot and pressed on, spreading out in a wider arc. Every rustle in the grass turned heads. A flash of movement resolved into a startled gazelle. A shadow in the trees became nothing more than the sway of branches. The land itself seemed to be hiding her, absorbing every trace. By noon, the temperature soared. The search slowed, and they gathered under a fig tree for water. A debate began. Should they concentrate efforts near the river, or move deeper inland toward the rocky outcrops? The guide argued for inland, claiming Sophia wouldn't risk the animals near the water. One of her friends disagreed, pointing out that she'd been fascinated by the river all morning before she vanished. The rangers made the call, split again. The inland team climbed toward higher ground, scanning from the ridge. Below them, the Nile snaked through the landscape like a silver thread. Somewhere out there, they believed, Sophia was still alive. But the hours were slipping away, and the unforgiving Ugandan wilderness, with its predators, heat, and sheer immensity, was closing its grip tighter with each passing moment. By late afternoon, the helicopter finally arrived. A faded green Bell 206, with its paint chipped from years in the sun. The sound of its rotors thundered over the park, scattering birds in every direction. From above, the pilot and spotters could see the endless expanse of golden grass, broken only by rivers, clumps of trees, and winding dirt tracks. The search teams on the ground looked like tiny moving dots. Over the radio, coordinates were exchanged, and the chopper began sweeping grids across the sector where Sophia had last been seen. Sophia's friends watched from below as the aircraft hovered, tilting to peer into thickets and scanning the banks of the Nile. At one point, the pilot banked sharply toward a glint in the grass, a metallic flash. The ground team rushed to the location, hearts pounding, only to find an empty soda can, sun-bleached and rusting. The disappointment hit hard. Hours passed with no new leads. The helicopter's fuel reserves began to run low, forcing it back to the city for refueling. The rangers decided to regroup at the lodge for a formal briefing. Inside the dim common room, maps were unrolled across a wooden table. The guide traced a finger along the southern track, pointing out places Sophia might have gone if she'd been walking with purpose. Her friends argued that her mental state might have led her to wander aimlessly instead. The rangers listened, then quietly reminded everyone that the park was not just vast. It was home to predators, treacherous terrain, and temperatures that could quickly drain a person's strength. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, one ranger approached with a discovery. A small torn strap from a backpack, tangled in grass about a kilometer from the creek. It was black nylon, similar to Sophia's, but without the rest of the bag, it was impossible to confirm. The find reignited hope and dread. When darkness fell again, the search halted. The rangers insisted it was too dangerous to continue without daylight, despite the group's protests. In her empty room, Sophia's belongings remained untouched, a silent reminder of the girl they had not yet found. The leather notebook was still missing. Somewhere out there in the dark, in a landscape that now felt more like a labyrinth than a paradise, the trail had gone cold again. The third day began with a heavy, uneasy silence. By now, word of Sophia's disappearance had spread beyond the park, reaching local authorities, embassy officials, and journalists. A few reporters had gathered near the lodge, their cameras ready, their questions sharp. The rangers kept them at a distance, focusing on organizing another full-scale sweep. Every resource they could spare was now committed. Sophia's friends were exhausted, but none of them could rest. Each morning felt like a race against an invisible clock. Today, the inland search team would push farther than before, into areas rarely visited by tourists. The terrain shifted quickly, from open plains to dense thickets, to rocky ridges that forced them to climb on hands and knees. Here, the air felt heavier, and the sounds of the savanna were muffled, as if the place itself was holding its breath. Mid-morning, a ranger called for a halt. He'd spotted something on a low branch. A thin thread of fabric, pale and frayed, caught in the bark. It looked like it could have been torn from clothing. One of Sophia's friends stared at it for a long moment before nodding. It matched the color of the shirt she'd been wearing. The discovery set everyone moving faster, fanning out to cover every possible path from that spot. But the land fought them at every turn. Thorny acacia tore at clothing and skin. Insect swarms clouded their vision. The heat became a constant, oppressive weight. At one point they reached a dried riverbed and found a series of prints. Faint, but human-shaped. They followed them for several hundred meters until they simply vanished into a patch of hard, cracked earth. The trail dissolved again. Meanwhile, back near the lodge, the guide was pulled aside by park officials. Quiet questions were asked about his qualifications, his license, and his decisions in the hours before Sophia disappeared. His answers were vague, often deflecting responsibility. He claimed he had no reason to think she would wander off, despite warnings from her companions. Still, there was no proof of wrongdoing, only a growing sense that mistakes had been made. As the sun began to fall, the teams returned empty-handed. The rangers spoke less now. The hope that had fueled them on day one was thinning. Sophia's friends, however, refused to accept the possibility that she might never be found. That night, one of them stood outside the lodge, staring into the dark plains, listening to the distant calls of hyenas. Somewhere in that vast blackness, Sophia's fate remained a mystery, and the wilderness kept its secrets. By the fourth day, the official search had transformed into something heavier, slower, no longer fueled by the adrenaline of an unfolding crisis, but by grim determination. The helicopter returned at first light, accompanied by drones brought in by a private search group. Their buzzing filled the air as they swept over grasslands and riverbanks, capturing high-resolution images for later analysis. The inland team pressed into a new sector, an area of rolling hills, dotted with termite mounds taller than a person. Here, the grass was dry and brittle, breaking underfoot with a sharp crunch. The rangers spaced themselves in a perfect line, moving forward together like a human net. Every so often, they stopped to mark a location with orange tape, noting any disturbance, a bent branch, a footprint too large for the local wildlife. Late in the morning, one of the drones spotted something near the edge of a shallow ravine, a cluster of objects glinting in the sun. The ground team scrambled to the coordinates, sliding down the slope. There, half buried in dust, lay 3 items: a pen, a cracked plastic water bottle, and a single page from a notebook. The page was smudged, the words barely legible. "Too far now. Keep walking." The discovery sent ripples of unease through the group. If Sophia had left this behind, it meant she had been moving steadily away from where she vanished. Possibly for hours, maybe even a full day. But why? And toward what? The rangers debated whether to follow the ravine or climb out to scan the plains beyond. In the end, they split again, half pursuing the gully while the others searched the high ground. Both teams pushed until the heat became unbearable, forcing them to pause. They regrouped by late afternoon, having found nothing more than animal bones and discarded trash. Back at the lodge, tensions flared. Sophia's friends pressed the guide with questions he didn't want to answer. Why had he ignored their concerns that morning? Why had he allowed her to sit so close to the open side of the vehicle? The guide snapped back, saying no one could have predicted this. The argument ended abruptly when a ranger entered, reporting no progress. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouted word. That night, under the sharp brilliance of the stars, the sense of finality began to creep in. 4 days in the African wild was a lifetime for someone without food, shelter, or protection from predators. Still, the next morning, they would rise again, pick up their gear, and step back into the vast unknown, because not searching was unthinkable. On the 5th day, the search became less about finding Sophia alive and more about finding any sign of her at all. The rangers expanded the perimeter far beyond the initial area, pushing into regions where even they rarely ventured. The air was thick with the scent of dust and wildflowers, the kind of clashing aromas that could only exist in untouched wilderness. The helicopter made slow sweeps over the most remote corners of the park, while the drones scanned the jagged ravines and dense undergrowth that humans couldn't easily reach. Every so often, the searchers on the ground stopped to listen, really listen, for anything that didn't belong in the natural chorus of birds, insects, and wind. But the land gave nothing back. By midday, the inland team stumbled upon a narrow cave opening hidden behind a wall of thorn bush. It was just large enough for a person to enter. Inside, the air was cool, and the ground was littered with dried leaves. They found no human traces, no fabric, no footprints, no belongings. Just the dark, empty space echoing the futility of their efforts. Meanwhile, back near the river, another group discovered an object caught in the reeds along the bank. A small leather-bound notebook, waterlogged and warped from exposure. The cover matched the one Sophia had been carrying the day she vanished. Carefully, they opened it, but the pages were blurred, the ink bleeding into illegible stains. Only a few words could be made out on one page. "Quiet is here." The find was taken to the lodge, where it became the focal point of speculation. Did Sophia reach the river and drop it by accident? Was it placed there deliberately? The rangers noted the proximity to crocodile nesting grounds and the strong currents that could sweep a person away within seconds. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the plains in gold and crimson, the lead ranger gathered everyone. The official search would scale back at dawn. Without new leads, the risk to the search teams outweighed the diminishing chance of recovery. Sophia's friends stood in stunned silence. The guide said nothing, his face unreadable in the fading light. In the weeks that followed, no further trace of Sophia was found. Years later, the case resurfaced when it emerged that the guide had been operating without a valid license, and questions of negligence became central to a legal battle. But in Murchison Falls, the land remained silent. Somewhere in its vast expanse, Sophia had vanished, leaving only fragments of her final moments, scattered like whispers the wilderness refused to give back.